Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman, or BEAR, is a research center at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, whose three programmatic missions are to research, educate, and engage in meaningful outreach with our academic, governmental, and industry partners. These monthly webinars are our way to hear firsthand from academics and practitioners who are making a meaningful impact in the world of behavioral insights, in particular, behaviorally informed business and evidence-based public policy. We are delighted today to have Kelly Peters, co-founder and CEO of BE Works, who will be talking to us today about driving innovation by bringing behavioral science to the boardroom. Before I introduce Kelly, I would like to go over the ground rules for this webinar. Following this introduction, our speaker will deliver a 35-minute presentation. And during this presentation, please submit questions for our speaker by clicking the chat tab at the top right of your WebEx screen and typing into the entry box. These questions will be visible to all the participants. At the end of the talk, and with time permitting, we will have a question and answer session in which I will select questions from the chat tab to ask our speaker. As a side note, please only use the Q&A tab for WebEx connectivity issues. Please send technical Q&As privately to Liz Kang, our WebEx technical guru. With all of those conditions out of the way, and without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Kelly Peters. Kelly Peters is the CEO and co-founder of BE Works. She is passionate about bringing scientific thinking to business strategy, marketing, and operations. Kelly is overseeing the launch of several new business ventures that capitalize on insights into consumer behavior. Her interest in behavioral science stems back to the late 90s when working on behavioral scoring models and credit risk and online distribution models, evolved through behavioral finance, and finally culminated in 2008 when she embraced behavioral economics as the most reliable approach to executing strategy. She launched what might be the world's first commercial application of behavioral field experiments while at RBC to help drive adoption of online service channels. Among the first to see commercial potential of the web in 1993, Kelly spent several years in the dot-com industry before focusing on financial services, where she then spent 12 years leading complex innovation projects, providing her with a rich background in innovation, technology, and human behavior. Kelly is also a faculty lecturer of applied behavioral science here at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, and regularly lectures at Cornell, Harvard, and other academies. She's a sought-after keynote speaker, has conducted 3 TEDx talks, and has been featured in the New York Times and Forbes. After studying philosophy and technology, Kelly earned an MBA from Dalhousie University and is a fellow of the Institute of Canadian Bankers. Thanks, Kelly, for being here today. One more final condition. You won't see any video apart from the slides, unlike our other speakers, so don't get worried. But thank you again, Kelly, for being here today, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Patrick, Liz, and the team at BEAR for this opportunity to share our exciting topic of driving innovation by bringing behavioral science to the boardroom. And I thank our participants so much for your time. I'm honored in your busy schedule to have the opportunity to share our perspective and experience with you, and I'm very happy to be a part of this community with you. So, without further ado, let's dive into this exciting topic. Senior executives say that innovation is required to drive growth, that in order to stay ahead of competitive forces, they need to continually find new ways to provide better value and a better experience for customers. And innovation isn't just for the front end of the business. They need it to optimize their business processes, such as distribution, the business models themselves, even the function of management in order to maintain competitiveness. And so they look to and talk about innovation for transforming these business processes. However, research done by McKinsey found that only 35% of senior executives that they surveyed had confidence in their firm's ability to be innovative, and that generally they're disappointed in their company's ability to have an innovative process. And so that has us ask the question of what explains this gap between management's aspirations and their team's ability to be innovative and to execute on innovation principles. Leaders tell their employees that they want them to be innovative. They do encourage it. But getting teams to be innovative is often a frustrating experience for most executives. Just wanting the behavior of innovation, though, won't make it so. Innovation as a mere mantra is not enough for people to actually figure out how to do innovation. The organization, we would say, needs to provide an operating model to make innovation happen. Innovation is an outcome, and it can be arrived at through a process. I have a story to illustrate this point. BE Works was working on a project with a large bank to improve credit card repayment behavior. And one test that we proposed was very simple. It was to print bill statements on colored paper instead of white paper. The rationale was that after a customer opens a bill, sometimes the paper will get buried, in a large stack of paper, like in the home office or on the kitchen table. And so then sometimes customers lose track of the bill when it's due. So we thought it might be a good strategy to just try and increase the visibility of the bills. If we use brightly colored paper instead of white, would this make a difference in terms of helping people remember to pay the bill? And, making it easier to see and find, having that color paper, stand out in the stack. And there is good scientific research that supports the role of color in increasing attention and actually in turn memory. So printing the bills on paper, in fact, would actually be a much lower cost approach than doing a color print of the bill itself, the text or the graphics. So we also thought that there would be value in seeing if using color paper itself would improve bill payment behavior. So we thought it's a simple concept, might be worthy of a simple test. However, we hit a roadblock. The manager in charge of the bill statements squashed the project because the cost of color paper is about 2 cents more per sheet than white paper. Look, while it's very small on the basis of individual sheets, obviously, however, it would add significant cost when deployed across every billing cycle, and these guys have millions of customers. So granted, the cost of this ultimately would not be insignificant. But the point of the experiment was to do a test to determine if using color paper would work at all, especially amongst high-risk customers and helping them pay the bill on time. Then we could see if the ROI would be worth the added cost. But the manager wouldn't approve the about $600 in paper costs to run the experiment. So I relayed this story to the company's CEO, and she was actually shocked. This was not consistent with the values that she had espoused. And yes, she wanted her team to be accountable for their P&L, but she never demanded that the executives or the rest of the team be penny pinchers. She had hoped and assumed that they would be ready, willing, and able to take on experiments and test out ideas when the opportunity presented itself. So we can turn to Joseph Schumpeter's research on creative destruction, and he would point out a cultural cause for this resistance. He'd written about this struggle that people have with having a paradoxical accountability for maintaining systems and ensuring their smooth operation while simultaneously being expected to disrupt that system. And so in the case of the bill statement project, this guy, the billing manager, was under tremendous pressure to ensure that the billing system was operating reliably and accurately. It's a mission critical part of operations and frankly vulnerable to errors. But because of that focus and his prioritization, he just simply was not well positioned to champion any kind of innovation of the system that he was accountable for overseeing. So, back to Schumpeter's credit, this this paradox is a reasonable part of the challenge of why organizations struggle to be innovative. Restating this with a metaphor, it's hard to build a car when you're busy maintaining the horses. But here's the thing. If people are unwilling to invest in something as simple and, the low cost is new paper, what can be expected when stakeholders are presented with ideas that are far more transformational? And I think, predictably, people are irrational about the risk and, in turn, resist innovation. So another part of this challenge is that there's too much emphasis on this broad concept of innovation as an aspiration and not enough support for the components that drive it. The goal of innovation is missing an operational framework to guide it and help make it happen. But we think we have an answer. Behavioral science, with its insights drawn from psychology and its foundation in the scientific method, offer us that framework. Behavioral science has received increasing support and interest in the public sphere in recent years, especially with Baylor's Nobel this year. In lauding its utility, most point to the objectivity in the approach and the connection to the underlying essence of human behavior. And both of these are integral aspects of why behavioral science is so powerful. However, an underappreciated benefit of behavioral science approaches is the capacity for driving innovation. So why? Why behavioral science for innovation? Well, most approaches to innovation are constrained by segmented organizational confines of department structures, where you've got a research team in one area of an organization with its reporting structure, you've got your implementation teams in another area, strategy somewhere else, and they're often operating independently. Behavioral science, on the other hand, gives us an all-encompassing approach that cuts across organizational hierarchies and structures and works end-to-end. And that's this framework that we have on the screen. So behavioral science provides powerful research insights into decision-making through the lens of understanding people's bounded rationality, the contextual factors, the heuristics and biases that influence decisions. This is juicy aspects of behavioral science that helps yield new ways of looking at old problems. But second, behavioral science gives us a set of strategies, including nudges, as they're called, that might be counterintuitive, but have an interesting and dramatic impact on people's behavior. And third, behavioral science provides a framework for execution through testing and learning, and that allows for the exploration of innovative approaches in a controlled and deliberative way. The emphasis on experimentation necessitates an orientation to trying new ways of doing things and promoting exploration into the unknown. So now that I've given you an overview of how we see behavioral science and what it entails in terms of this end-to-end from research to strategy to actually execution, I want to share how we've translated that into the BE Works method, and I'm just so excited to be sharing this in a public forum. It's a framework that I and my team, Dan Ariely, Nina Mazar, and the incredible gang that we have here, we've been refining this over 10 years with working with companies and governments around the world through hundreds of experiments. And we see this framework as providing the steps to bring innovation to life. Fundamentally, it's a fusion of insights on human behavior, the scientific method, and an outcome and action-oriented consulting method that's tailored to the needs of the organization. So let's go through the 5-phased BE-Works method. We won't have time to do a detailed examination of the methodology, but this will hopefully provide you with enough of an understanding of how we believe that behavioral science can be used to drive innovation in different organizations. And as we look at each phase of the BE-Works method, I'm also going to illustrate a project that we did, a behavioral challenge step by step. So we do the framework, and then we're going to look at a case, and we're going to go back to the next step. So we hope that that is a helpful method for you in today's discussion. So let's start with discovery. The BE-Works method starts here, and I want to illustrate discovery as a process by reminding you of an experience that you've likely had. I want you to recall if you've ever been in a grocery store and noticed that the line you were in seemed to be the slowest one. So did you find yourself wondering, first of all, like, why is your line the slowest? Did you start to study things like, what kinds of products does the customer ahead of you have, and who's being run through? Like, did you look to see if the cashier was, wrangling maybe a lot of produce, where the stickers are hard to find? Maybe you were looking to see if maybe the cashier was something was, they were moving slower, they seemed like they were newer. Sometimes maybe you might notice that they have kind of re-swiped things a few times over the scanner, or maybe it was the cashier. Maybe they're socializing with customers, or talking to other cashiers. So I could go on, but the point is this process of studying the environment that we've probably all done, right, is what we mean by gathering observations. And then you start to find yourself perhaps curious, this next step, maybe once you find that reason, did you then find yourself perhaps curious about, what might make the checkout experience quicker, for instance? Maybe you started to think about, shouldn't they have like a larger scanner instead of that little square? Maybe that scanner should be bigger. Or what if the beam, is angled from 2 different directions instead of just from the bottom, but if it was 2 ways, then it sometimes turn stuff around. So maybe you found yourself thinking about training, or self-service aisles. Maybe you started to think about how we could possibly optimize the system. Look, the point of this is that you're challenging assumptions about the status quo and starting to create a specific empirical question of what might make this process better, what might make this process faster. That is discovery. That is the starting point of scientific thinking. Discovery from the science lens is all about fostering curiosity. It's about challenging assumptions. It's about gathering observations and creating empirical questions. 2 other critical components of discovery are the identification of the behavior that we're trying to change and identifying how to measure that behavior. It's incredibly important to get this right, but it's not so easy to do. Let me illustrate this with a recent experience I had in a boardroom. It was pretty big. A large bank had an incident that was captured in the headline, big time, and impacted the trust that clients had in the organization. And these guys were very keen to launch strategies to address it. And we were brought in to identify steps that they could take to repair this breach in trust. So here's what we did. In the first meeting with the leadership team, we gave them a sheet of paper. And we asked them to write down the definition of trust. Right after they grabbed their pens, what we started to see in their faces was that they realized that this was not as easy a task as one might think it would be. We know that people have a strong intuitive understanding of what trust is. But as we went around the room that day, first of all, we were able to see that none of their definitions were the same. None of them were that deep or comprehensive. Trust is a complex emotion. In fact, understanding trust, it's a very large area of scientific research with significant efforts across not only psychology, but economics and sociology and other fields. And just to give you a glimpse, for instance, we know that there are many factors at play in this definition of trust, three of which would be one's belief in the honesty, fairness, the benevolence of the trustee. And from empirical research, we know that a failure in trust may be forgiven more easily if it's interpreted as a failure of competence rather than a lack of honesty or benevolence. So just for instance, right, the understanding of these important nuances can have a significant impact on organizational strategy. Okay, so that's about creating operational definitions. After we got the leadership team to experience this challenge of creating a clear, consistent definition of trust, we then asked them to write down how they would measure it. Specifically, what behaviors ought we look for that would show if customers had more or less trust in the bank? Because otherwise, how would we know if the strategies were effective or ineffective or worse, backfiring? So this exercise of actually creating the measures was even harder than creating the definition. And so the point is creating operational definitions so that there is consensus on what we're trying to change and how we're going to measure it are very important parts of starting any project. This clarity of thinking is key to the scientific method. It lets us build consensus on what we're trying to change and provides the foundation to measure whether or not we're successful in driving that change. I'd like to share this case study with you so that you can get an understanding of behavioral science in action. So one of our clients is one of Canada's largest for-profit colleges, and they have over 30 campuses across the country with vocational training programs. And these programs are designed for adult learners who are looking to re-enter the workforce or change their careers or attain a post-secondary education that wouldn't be available through traditional channels. And in their integrated learning approach, learners can choose when they want to attend campus to complete their coursework at individual computer workstations. However, the learners must hit monthly attendance targets to remain eligible for financial aid and to stay on track in order to graduate on time. But there's a problem. How do they give students the flexibility to attend campus whenever they want, while also helping ensure that they have the discipline to attend class? And there are many different behavioral issues to address. And one of our goals in this initiative was to increase in-class attendance. And so, first of all, we worked with the organization to create a baseline and then a reasonable target to aim for. So this is this first phase of how we would describe discovery and the things that we suggest would be critical to emphasize. So once there's clarity on the targeted behavior and we have ways to measure it, then the consumer journey can be mapped and the barriers and enablers to the behavior identified. So what's powerful about behavioral scientific approaches is the way that understanding the fundamental aspects of human psychology can be brought to bear in diverse settings. By looking at the world from a behavioral lens, a fresh and unique set of parameters about a problem can be discovered. The foundation of behavioral economics is an understanding that people are boundedly rational, that given these constraints in time and energy and resources, people look for cues to help them make decisions, such as looking for social norms, looking to experts, looking for the least complex path. These approaches are different than making a decision based on a careful weighing of all of the options. And as some of you who are already deeply familiar with behavioral economics would know, this term of these mental shortcuts are called heuristics. And what underpins behavioral diagnostics research then is the scientific literature from social psychology, cognitive psychology, neuroscience, marketing and consumer behavior, decision science. These repositories provide a treasure trove of insight about human behavior. There's so much that is already known and understood about behavior, and this knowledge is incredibly useful to ensure that strategies don't need to be created from scratch. So we would say that the consumer journey should be analyzed from the first moment of catching a consumer's attention to their perception of the factors of the decision. It should consider how exactly they're making their evaluation. We should then understand what they decide. And then finally, that largest of chasms, which is the one between thinking and doing, that action. And then lastly, the consumer journey should also consider how consumers maintain their behavior and their consistency with prior choices. And each of these decision points brings with it a set of barriers and enablers that can help or hinder this targeted behavior. So we call this analysis the behavioral diagnostics. And so now let's take a look at the behavioral diagnostics in the case of the class attendance project. So when we created the detailed journey map for the career college, it revealed a host of behavioral barriers that may be keeping adult learners from hitting their monthly attendance targets. So we uncovered procrastination, planning problems, fragile confidence, a lack of positive reinforcement, to name a few. And because most of these learners proceed through the program working in isolation, we decided to prioritize a lack of social support as a key barrier to student engagement, which manifests in low attendance rates. So then the question got narrowed and became, can we create behavioral interventions that foster an atmosphere of social support? Okay, so now we're going to move to the third phase of the BE method. This is the ideation phase that's dedicated to designing these behaviorally informed solutions to influence behavior. And across the journey, the target behaviors we're trying to encourage, as well as the channels that we have available to us, lets us build interventions at each stage. So this is what's interesting in terms of what we've observed working with businesses, is that many of the leaders are coming from backgrounds in financing or finance or engineering or business administration, for example. The thing is, many of these disciplines are actually predicated on the presumption that people are rational agents. And so whether it's customers or employees or even themselves, most people then assume that incentives or information will be effective enough in getting individuals to alter their behavior. For instance, if you want people to save more, then either give them a financial incentive or explain the benefits of fiscal responsibility. But those of you who are knowledgeable of behavioral economics, we know that it's not so simple. Those that are familiar with the history of academic scholarship and decision-making research know that humans don't always operate as rational agents, and that what can be counterintuitive can actually act as a surprising inducement to change. And so by adopting a behavioral scientific perspective and embracing the irrationality of people, it opens us up to a world of ideas for innovation. As the body of evidence in behavioral science continues to expand, this effective tactic continues to grow. We know, for instance, that defaults and loss aversion have an incredible sway on behavior in almost every conceivable context. Okay, so to better understand the ideation phase in action, let's return to the career college example. So the idea of reaching out to individual students to encourage attention is actually novel in and of itself, but it's even more innovative when rooted in behavioral science. So we believe that in order to create a more social, supportive learning environment, that these weekly messages ought to be sent to students through both email or text from a success team that we called, that provided encouragement to students and got them to commit to weekly attendance goals, and then provided these reminders that they were not alone. So these messages harnessed well-studied behavioral tactics such as positive reinforcement, we use pre-commitment, and social belonging. We know that messaging interventions of this kind have been successful in driving behaviors in other domains, such as energy conservation, loan repayment, and even medication adherence. So now we're going to explore the experimentation phase. So we know that there are many subtle environmental, social, and psychological factors that influence behavior. And given the complexities of these different factors, it's then crucial that interventions be measured through a sound scientific approach. Experiments are more predictive of actual behavior than other market research methods, as they allow companies to test ideas in real-world settings. So controlled experiments then allow us to make causal claims that tie our interventions to behavioral change. So let's look at this for the career college again. In order to test this idea of the communications intervention, we ran a randomized control test. Newly enrolled students were sequentially assigned to receive weekly messages through the email, through the SMS text, or neither. So we had approximately 250 students assigned to each of the three conditions. And then we tracked their attendance over a 10-week period in order to test our hypothesis that students receiving messages would attend campus more often than students not receiving messages. So the choice architecture phase. The choice architecture phase is when we bring the statistical analysis of the experiment together to help us with the hypotheses, to help us understand what interventions worked, what didn't, what was the degree of their effectiveness, and bringing that together to help formulate the basis of calculation of ROI. This approach allows for the best identification and quantification of true success, as well as the opportunity to learn from failure. Okay, so here's what we found in the case of the career college study. So our preliminary findings indicate that learners in both of the messaging conditions, email and text, do attend campus more often than learners in the control condition. In fact, learners in our communications group are attending campus about 5% more often than those in the control group, a statistically significant difference. No other business strategy to date has had this kind of impact, and the effect shows up immediately on week 1 of the intervention and persists over the entire 10-week duration of the messaging campaign. So in the coming months, we'll be examining the impact of our interventions on a host of other outcomes, such as grades. We'll also capture their subjective experience, which we'll measure through surveys, and then, of course, graduation rates. So this intervention is scalable, it's easy to implement, and delivers a high ROI. Okay, so now that we've worked through the BE-Works method and applied it to a case study, let's explore the broader question of how behavioral science can drive innovation. So in addition to fostering curiosity and having a powerful mechanism to challenge organizational assumptions and preconceived notions about what works or what won't work, 3 other ways that behavioral science contributes to innovation are the democratization of ideas, which I think is the thing that I find the most powerful and compelling and transformational. Second is the role of experimentation for risk mitigation, which is critical for organizational innovation opportunities. And then a third one is the idea of systematic optimization. So let me just dive a little bit deeper into those benefits. So first of all, for democratization of ideas, what experiments do is put ideas on a level playing field. It doesn't matter who suggested the idea. You know, this hippo, it doesn't matter if the idea came from, the highest paid opinion in the room, an alleged expert, or the intern. What works independent of the idea's origin. And that's the power of the democratizing effect of experimentation. Its objective measurement illuminates the true efficacy of ideas. Experimentation is then, it's the great equalizer, as all ideas tested are given a fair evaluation. This idea of risk mitigation then, experimentation offers a method or a safe space to test risky ideas. Many products and services fail when they're put on the market. So we dove into the research, and it turns out, the exact number is debated. We saw kind of speculative rates that are around, high, 80 to 95% failure rates. And then we saw published estimates in different sectors, 35% for healthcare products, almost 50% for consumer goods. But no matter the specific failure rate, we can all agree that many fail, and this is a waste of money and time. Why do they fail? Poor timing, low uniqueness, bad planning, technical difficulties, company politics, poor pricing. These are some of the reasons that have been identified for product failures. But the question we need to ask is, do we need to accept failing products as a cost of doing business, or can we reduce the failure rate? And if we could reduce the failure rate, how would we do it? Experimentation can help an organization tweak strategies faster and cheaper and provide more confidence in the results. So the true power of experimentation is testing risky ideas. So the most sort of bang for your buck innovation-wise is in having the safe space and a sound methodology to try ideas that would not have otherwise been explored. So the third benefit of behavioral science is the provision of a framework for systematic optimization. This means constantly exploring opportunities to expand on what the organization's previously learned. Science itself is predicated on incremental progress and sometimes radical paradigm shifts. This process can be built into the organizational DNA through an operating model that's designed to promote innovation. So while individual experiments are useful and great for gleaning insights about specific situations and challenges, continual innovation in behavioral science provides an ecosystem that promotes broader and more systemic innovation. So what we recommend is bringing the best practices of the scientific academy to life in the business world. We propose a target operating model for innovation that spans people and process and technology. For people, we propose providing mentorship and resources to teach and empower employees to use experimentation. This means fostering curiosity and systematically nurturing questions like, I wonder if. Further, organizations should encourage people to leverage what science can tell us about human behavior and helping cross the bridge between the real world and the so-called ivory tower, building out incredible insights on human behavior. For process, we recommend establishing key processes that enable employees to execute experiments and then be able to share the results and learnings across the organization in a systematic way. And this will help facilitate a clarity of thinking in designing questions so that they're empirical, they're falsifiable, the questions can be asked and answered and resolved so that organizations can move forward with adopting new ideas and letting go with confidence the sacred cows that are not generating the value that was believed to be there. So this means creating key measures for the organization and ensuring their reliability and validity. Specifically, for instance, if there's a measure of trust or loyalty, it needs to reliably correlate to behavior in the world. Best practice then should be to orient organizational terminology and metrics to the language and measures that are used in science, so as to maximize the interconnection between others around the world working on the same challenges, the same concepts. And then third, in the target operating model for innovation, we recommend the use of technology to support the communication, documentation, and archiving of research and experiments. This means having the infrastructure for the publication and dissemination and peer review processes, case studies being shared for peer review during projects. Teams ought to meet through an annual academic style conference where research is presented and discussed, and teams can incrementally move forward with their learnings and sharing their learnings. So one more point on this is that it would be ideal for companies and governments to figure out and consider how they can give back to the scientific community by sharing these learnings in the form of white papers, submitting and participating in academic conferences and academic publications. Doing this would facilitate an exchange between basic and applied research. This would be mutually beneficial for all who are interested in innovative approaches to improving outcomes for individuals, organizations, and society. So these are a few of the steps that organizations can take to incorporate the best practices of behavioral science and establish the foundation for a culture of scientific thinking. In conclusion, behavioral science can be used to identify both incremental and radical innovation. But the point of this presentation is that the most radical innovation comes from the transformation of the organization itself through behavioral science. A behavioral scientific framework, then, is one that harnesses the power of intuition, the wisdom of experience, and the richness and robustness of behavioral insights, all ultimately put to the test by the scientific method. This will give organizations what they need to enable and empower their ability to be innovative, which in turn will transform the economy and society through scientific thinking. I hope that you found that useful, and I look forward to your questions and our ongoing discussion.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Kelly. So I think we have time for at most 3 questions. We'll just get right to it. So one of our participants asked, within the BE Works process, are you ever concerned with clients' projects in such in situations in which nudging may be costly to the consumer's future self?
Yes, definitely. But we've been lucky in that the organizations that we've worked with, financial services, energy, and these other domains, they they have wanted the best interest for the client. We have not been put in a position where we've been asked to nudge people into things that would not be in their best interest.
Great. Okay. Another question, there's actually a few questions on this, is regarding kind of informed consent, as we say in academia. The general theme of these questions is that research has shown that nudges work, also when people are aware they're nudged. Do you think it should be mandatory to tell people if they're targeted by behavioral instruments, especially in order to maintain positive attitudes towards behavioral economics? And also, is there any sort of ethics procedure that you all go through before kind of running RCTs?
Yeah, these are very important questions. The nudges and tactics that we use are always aligned to the person's best interest. We're trying to increase graduation rates, or we're trying to increase comprehension of energy pricing, helping them to purchase the right insurance product that meets their coverage needs. The thing about behavioral science is that just like advertisers have always been trying to do, we're trying to get to the best outcome. Trying different tactics in and of itself isn't unethical. We're just structured in terms of how we're testing these different strategies. And more importantly, we're actually trying to understand the impact that these things have. So now, instead of just trying things on consumers without having a good hypothesis of the outcome, without understanding that we're not potentially backfiring and decreasing their comprehension, for instance, instead, we're just taking a systematic approach. So that doesn't require a specific declaration. If anything, that would just get in the way.
Great. Maybe we'll have one more question after this last one. So when you face blocks to innovation, how do you use behavioral economics, especially to nudge traditional clients, kind of the hardest of those clients to nudge?
Yes. There's a few approaches in terms of starting a first project. One of the things that we have found very successful is, there's this interest and temptation to just come in and talk about the behavioral insights, the fun quirks or some of the gimmicks of behavioral science. And there's this temptation to come in and share that and expect a skeptical audience to be convinced. And there is some elements of success in that approach. But what we have found to be the most successful approach is when you can get an organization to agree to run a very small experiment. When people actually see data come to life, when they see evidence come to life on a question that they have, that becomes the most compelling way to demonstrate the benefits of a different approach. Now, sometimes it's hard to even get the client on board, because it's complex or expensive. Running experiments, as Steven Pinker once said, is subversive, and expensive, and very difficult to do. And that's true. Experiments are not always very easy, but perhaps even just to get this immediate benefit, just even running an experiment in that first meeting, instead of talking about behavioral economics, one can even test running a simple anchoring experiment and show, well, we've done this so many times, we actually just run a simple anchoring experiment. Even amongst those who have familiarity with it, we still see, that effect hold. And this becomes this very powerful, persuasive tool on not only the power of behavioral insights, but the value and benefit of the scientific method for organization. So the faster and sooner one can get to experiments, even something as simple as exploring a common experiment in the meeting room, is a very powerful way to convince organizations of not only the power of behavioral insights, but actually starting to run their own experiments.
Great. I don't think we'll have time for another question. I think we should probably wrap up here. But thank you all for all your questions. We received a lot of questions, probably more than most of our prior webinars. So thanks for the especially robust activity. So again, we'd like to thank Kelly and all the team at BE-Works for participating in this webinar today. A full recording of this webinar will be available at our website in just a few hours by clicking the side tab labeled Events and then clicking the sub-tab labeled Bear Webinar Series. For those who are interested, our next webinar will be on February 22nd, in just about a month, and we will hear from Liam Delaney, who is a professor at the University of Stirling, who studies self-control problems through individuals' life cycles, the link between biology and intertemporal decision-making, and the link between unemployment and well-being. So it promises to be a very interesting webinar. So we'd like, again, to thank everyone at BE-Works, especially Kelly, for this webinar today. And we also like to thank you all for attending. So this concludes this webinar. You can exit this webinar now by closing your WebEx screen. And thanks again for attending.